Imagine the world as it was during the last great ice age. There were no forests yet, no rushing rivers, only the immense, heavy white blanket of the Laurentide ice sheet. It was a layer of ice nearly 2 miles thick, a weight beyond human comprehension, pressing down upon the continent. It did not move with speed. It moved with the inevitability of time itself. If you were to stand there and watch it, you would see nothing change in an hour, or a day, or even a year. It was a movement measured in centuries, a slow, creeping slide from the north, grinding against the bedrock of the earth. Beneath this colossal weight, the land was being shaped. The jagged peaks of the ancient mountains were worn down, smoothed by the relentless friction of the ice. It was a process of abrasion, millions of tons of ice acting as a file against the stone. The limestone, gray and cool, and the softer shale beneath it, surrendered to the pressure. They crumbled into dust, into sand, into the fine silt that would one day line the bottom of the valley. This particular valley, the Mohawk Valley, was special in its geology. To the north stood the hard, unyielding granite of the Adirondack Mountains. To the south rose the Catskills and the endless ridges of the Appalachians. But here, in this specific corridor, the earth had given way. The ice found a weakness in the rock, a gap between the mountain ranges, and it pushed through. It carved a low, flat path, the only break in the Appalachian chain for thousands of miles. It was a natural gateway formed by the sheer, monotonous persistence of the glacier. As the millennia drifted by, the climate began to shift, slowly, imperceptibly. The great cold began to recede. The ice sheet, having done its work, began to melt. It pulled back toward the north, leaving behind vast lakes of meltwater. This was not a rushing flood, but a rising stillness. The water pooled in the deep basin the ice had carved, forming the ancient glacial lake Iroquois. The water was cold, dark, and still. In the silence of this ancient lake, sediments began to settle. Fine particles of clay and earth drifted down through the water, layer upon layer, year after year. They coated the valley floor, smoothing out every imperfection, creating a bed of soil that was perfectly flat. It was a leveling of the world. The chaos of the rocks was buried under a blanket of soft, uniform mud. Eventually, the water found its outlet and drained away toward the sea, leaving behind the valley as we would come to know it. But the memory of the ice remained. The land was left scarred and shaped. Large boulders, known as erratics, sat alone in the middle of flat fields, dropped there by the melting ice, resting in solitary stillness. The walls of the valley were steep, yet the floor was a gentle, rolling plain. The geology settled into a long slumber. The wind blew over the empty landscape, whispering through the grasses that eventually took root. The sun rose and set over the limestone cliffs. There was no sound of industry, no rhythm of labor, only the quiet breathing of the earth. The Mohawk Valley lay waiting, a perfect, flat corridor carved by the slow hand of nature, waiting for the time when water would return to flow gently through its heart once more. Time moved forward, drifting from the geological ages into the era of men, yet the silence remained. It simply moved indoors, far away from the muddy banks of the Mohawk River, within the sturdy brick walls of a surveyor's study in Albany. The dream of the canal was being translated onto paper. It was the year 1817, and the night had settled heavily over the city. Outside, the streets were empty and dark, save for the occasional watchman. But inside the study, a single sphere of warm, yellow light held back the shadows. The room was defined by the scent of old things, the dry, musky smell of bound leather books, the sharp tang of iron gall ink, and the sweet, heavy aroma of burning beeswax. In the center of the room stood a heavy oak desk, its surface scarred by years of work, vast and cluttered with the tools of geometry. Here, the wild, rugged landscape described in the ancient rocks was being tamed by the quiet precision of mathematics. A single candle sat in a brass holder, its flame standing upright and still in the breathless air. The wick was trimmed low, burning with a steady amber glow that illuminated the texture of the large parchment spread across the wood. The paper was thick, creamy in color, and rolled at the corners, held down by heavy weights made of lead. If you looked closely, you could see the fibers in the paper, the minute imperfections where the ink would soon settle. The surveyor sat in a high-backed wooden chair, his posture curved over the desk. There was no rush in his movements. His hand reached out slowly to the inkwell, a small glass reservoir filled with fluid as dark as the night outside. He held a quill stripped from the feather of a goose, sharpened to a precise point with a pen. He dipped the nib into the ink, pausing for a moment to let the excess liquid drip back into the well drip before moving his hand to the paper. The sound that followed was the only disruption to the silence, the rhythmic, scratching friction of the quill against the parchment. It was a dry, whispering sound, like dry leaves skittering across a stone path. Scritch, scratch, pause. The surveyor was drawing a contour line, tracing the elevation of the land near Rome, New York. He moved the pen with deliberate slowness, ensuring the line remained steady. The ink flowed from the nib, turning from a glistening wet black to a matte charcoal as it dried into the fibers of the paper. Beside the map lay the instruments of measurement, gleaming dully in the candlelight. There was a brass compass, its two legs waiting to walk distances across the map. There was a protractor, cold to the touch, used to measure the subtle angles of the canal's proposed curve. There was a ruler made of boxwood, its edges worn smooth by the friction of 1,000 fingers over 1,000 nights. The surveyor picked up the ruler, placing it gently against the paper. He measured the distance between two theoretical locks, calculating the rise and fall of the water that did not yet exist. He wrote down numbers in the margins. The numbers were small and neat, columns of calculations regarding cubic yards of earth and degrees of incline. He thought of the limestone bedrock, imagining the depth at which the canal bed must sit. He calculated the slope needed for water to flow at a gentle pace, not too fast to erode the banks, not too slow to become stagnant. It was a puzzle of gravity and friction, solved in the quiet hours of the night. The candle burned lower, the wax pooling at the base of the flame, occasionally dripping down the side of the candle in a slow, viscous tear. The shadows in the corners of the room stretched and retreated with the faint flickering of the light. Dust motes danced in the golden halo around the flame, suspended in the air, moving in slow, lazy circles. There was no shouting here, no sweat, no mud. There was only the abstract idea of the canal, existing entirely within the quiet scratching of the pen and the steady focus of the mind. The blueprint grew more detailed with every passing hour, a web of lines and numbers that would one day guide the shovels. But for now, it was just ink drying slowly by the warmth of a candle in a sleeping city. The blueprints were rolled away, and the quiet study was left behind. Now, the dream of the canal had to be etched into the physical world, not with ink, but with iron and muscle. Under the wide, pale sky of an early New York summer, the work began. It was not a sudden burst of activity, but rather a slow, synchronized movement that would stretch across the state for years. It was the rhythm of the spade and the shovel, a cadence as steady as a heartbeat. Imagine a line of men standing in the tall grass, stretching as far as the eye can see. They stood in the shallow depression of the earth that would one day be the ditch. The air was thick with the humidity of the morning, carrying the rich, damp scent of overturned soil. There was no machinery here, no engines roaring, only the soft, repetitive sounds of manual labor. The tool of choice was the shovel or the spade. Its handle was made of smooth, sanded ash or hickory wood, worn to a soft polish by the friction of leather gloves and calloused palms. The blade was heavy iron, darkened by the dirt. The motion was always the same, a cycle repeated thousands of times a day, millions of times a year. First, the blade was positioned. The metal tip rested against the surface of the ground, amidst the roots of clover and wild grass. Then came the sound. It was the sound of the boot pressing down on the shoulder of the blade, driving the iron deep into the loam. It was a dull, heavy sound, absorbed instantly by the density of the earth. Next was the leverage. The handle was pulled back, the wood creaking ever so slightly. The earth groaned as it was pried loose from its ancient resting place. Then the lift. The soil was heavy, a dense mixture of clay and silt, dark and cool. The laborer swung the load in a low arc, a pendulum of weight and gravity. Finally, the release. The soil was tossed onto the spoil bank, the growing mound of earth alongside the ditch. It landed with a soft thud or a crumbling swish, depending on the dryness of the dirt. Then the shovel was lowered again. The blade found a new spot. Inches from the last, the boot rose. The iron sank, she-chunk, lift, swing, thud. This rhythm became a hypnotic trance. Along the line, the sound multiplied. It sounded like a great, slow-moving beast breathing. There was the scrape of metal on small stones, a faint clink that would ring out briefly before being swallowed by the vastness of the valley. There was the rustle of fabric as sleeves moved against torsos. There was the sound of the wind moving through the nearby trees. A whispering companion to the digging. Progress was measured in inches. To watch the work was like watching the hour hand of a clock. You knew it was moving, yet it seemed perfectly still. A wheelbarrow would sit waiting, its wooden sides bleached by the sun. Shovel by shovel, it would fill. The dirt piled up in a small pyramid in the center of the barrow. When it was full, a man would lift the handles, balancing the single wooden wheel, and trundle it slowly up a wooden plank. The wheel would creak rhythmically, ra, slow, mournful song of friction. The sun moved its own slow path across the sky, casting changing shadows into the deepening trench. The soil changed, too, as they dug deeper. First, the dark topsoil, full of roots and life. Then, the lighter, sandy subsoil. Finally, the dense, gray clay that would hold the canal's water like a bowl. There was no urgency in this rhythm, for urgency tires the body too quickly. There was only persistence. The repetition cleared the mind. The world narrowed down to the simple geometry of the pit, the rectangle of the cut, the curve of the shovel, the arc of the soil flying through the air. It was a lullaby of labor, a slow excavation of the earth, deepening the channel one spadeful at a time, while the rest of the world slept under the warm afternoon sun, while the ditch was a testament to the removal of earth. The locks were a monument to the addition of weight. Here, the soft, yielding soil ended, and the era of gray permanence began. To navigate the changes in elevation across the undulating New York landscape, the canal required locks, great chambers of stone that would act as elevators for the water. The construction of these walls was a process of extreme slowness, a quiet conversation between the mason, the chisel, and the rock. The material of choice was limestone. It was quarried from the nearby earth, pulled from the ground as heavy, rough-hewn boulders. These were not yet the smooth, uniform blocks of the lock walls. They were raw and chaotic. The transformation from boulder to block happened in the stone yard, a place of white dust and repetitive sound. Picture a mason sitting on a low wooden stool. Before him sits a massive cube of gray stone weighing hundreds of pounds. In his left hand, he holds a steel chisel, the head mushroomed from years of use. In his right hand is a heavy wooden mallet. The rhythm is distinct and higher in pitch than the digging. Clink, clink, clink. It is a sharp, metallic sound that resonates briefly before vanishing. The mason is not breaking the stone. He is dressing it. He is shaving off mere millimeters of rock to create a perfectly flat face. He taps the chisel, and a small flake of limestone falls away, sliding down the side of the block to join a pile of gray chips on the ground. He moves the chisel half an inch to the left. Clink. This process repeats for hours, moving across the surface of the stone like a slow tide, until the rough face is as smooth as a frozen pond. The air around the mason is filled with a fine, chalky dust that settles on his eyelashes, his hat, and the ground, turning everything a ghostly shade of pale gray. Once the stones were cut, they had to be stacked. A simple wooden derrick, a crane made of pine logs and hemp rope, stood over the lock pit. A block was harnessed in chains. With the slow turning of a winch creak, ratchet, the stone was lifted into the air. It hovered there, a suspended monolith, heavy and silent. Then, with agonizing care, it was lowered. The masons guided it with their hands, feeling the cold, rough surface. It settled onto the course of stones below it with a deep, solid thud, a sound of finality. But stone alone could not hold back the water. Between the blocks lay the mortar. For the Erie Canal, a special discovery had been made: hydraulic cement, a mixture capable of hardening even when underwater. The preparation of this mortar was a study in viscosity in large wooden troughs. The pulverized limestone ash was mixed with sand and water. A worker would use a long-handled hoe to pull through the mixture. The sound was wet and heavy slosh, drag, squelch. The hoe moved through the gray sludge, folding it over and over, eliminating every pocket of dry air, ensuring a perfect, creamy consistency. It was a thick, heavy paste, cool to the touch and smelling of wet earth and ancient minerals. the mason would take a trowel, scoop up a dollop of this gray paste, and spread it across the top of the lower stone. He smoothed it out like butter, creating a level bed. The upper stone was then placed on top, squishing the excess mortar out from the seams. The mason would run the edge of his trowel along the joint, scraping away the extra, leaving a clean, flush line of gray between the blocks. Then came the waiting. The drying of mortar is a process that cannot be seen, only trusted. It is a chemical reaction occurring deep within the molecular structure of the material. As the sun beat down on the lock walls, or as the cool night air settled in, the water slowly evaporated from the mixture, and the crystals within the cement began to interlock. It was a hardening that took days, weeks. To the observer, the wall looked exactly the same at noon as it did at dusk, gray, solid, motionless. But inside the joints, the liquid was becoming rock, binding the separate blocks into a single immovable entity. The lock walls rose, course by course, tier by tier. They stood straight and tall, cool shadows forming at their base. There was no water in them yet, just the dry, empty chamber of stone and the drying lines of mortar, curing slowly in the silence, preparing to hold the weight of the canal for 100 years to come, while the stone locks cured in the sun and the ditch stretched slowly across the valley. A different kind of quiet industry was taking place in the wooden sheds near the water's edge. Here, the air was not filled with the smell of wet earth or lime, but with the warm, resinous fragrance of the forest. It was a dry, sweet scent, a perfume of pine and oak that hung heavy in the stillness of the boatyards. These were the dry docks, the berthing places of the canal boats known as packet boats and heavy barges. The workshops were large, barn-like structures with high vaulted ceilings where swallows nested in the rafters. The light inside was dim and amber-hued, filtering through the dust-coated windows and the cracks in the siding. Beams of sunlight cut through the gloom, illuminating millions of tiny particles of sawdust floating in the air. These specks of wood dust drifted in slow motion, swirling gently with every movement of a carpenter's arm, eventually settling to join the soft, golden carpet that covered the floor. The materials for the boats lay stacked in neat piles, curing in the shadows. There was the white oak, heavy and dense, brought down from the old-growth forests. This was the wood for the skeleton of the boat, the keel and the ribs. It was hard, stubborn wood, cool to the touch and gray-barked. Then there was the white pine, lighter and softer, destined to become the long planks of the hull and the deck. The pine was rich with sap, sticky and fragrant, smelling of deep summer days in the evergreen woods. The construction of a barge was not a matter of speed, but of symmetry and fit. A carpenter would stand at a long workbench, his apron covered in fine shavings. In his hands, he held a smoothing plane, a tool of iron and wood designed to level the surface of a plank. The motion was hypnotic. He placed the plane at the far end of a 12-foot board. He leaned forward, applying steady pressure, and pushed the tool toward him, she-wisp. The blade sliced a paper-thin layer of wood from the board. A long, perfect curl of wood shaving rose from the mouth of the plane, spiraling like a ribbon. It was a pale, cream-colored coil that fell softly to the floor. She-wisp, he repeated the stroke, overlapping the previous one by a fraction of an inch. The sound was a rhythmic exhalation, a soft friction that smoothed the rough timber into glass-like perfection. Once the frame was built, looking like the rib cage of a great wooden whale, the planking began. Longboards were steamed to make them pliable. Large copper kettles boiled water, sending slow clouds of steam into the rafters. The wood was held in the steam until the fibers relaxed, allowing the carpenters to bend the thick planks around the gentle curve of the hull. They were clamped into place, groaning softly as they settled into their new shape, cooling and hardening back into rigidity. Then came the caulking, perhaps the most monotonous task of all. To make the boat watertight, the seams between the planks had to be filled. A worker would sit on a low stool alongside the hull, armed with a mallet and a caulking iron. On his lap lay a coil of oakum rope fibers treated with tar. He would twist a strand of oakum, place it against the seam, and tap it in. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was dull and repetitive, a heartbeat against the wood. Tap, tap, tap. Inch by inch, foot by foot, the gaps were filled. The smell of the tar mixed with the sawdust, a sharp, pungent scent that spoke of preservation. The tar was heated in a pot. It flowed like molasses, thick and slow, bubbling slightly as it filled the cracks, then cooling into a shiny, waterproof seal. The workshop remained quiet, save for these small sounds of creation. There was no conversation, only the language of wood and tool. The floor grew deeper in shavings, softening every footstep. The boat sat there, a massive wooden vessel, waiting for a medium it had not yet met, resting in the dry, scented air of the shed, surrounded by the dust of its own making. The boat was finished, a hollow wooden shell floating high and buoyant upon the still water. It bobbed gently, light and eager, but its purpose was to carry the weight of the new world. At the wharf in Buffalo, under a sky the color of slate, the process of filling the hold began. It was not a chaotic rush of commerce, but a slow, mathematical accumulation of mass. It was a transfer of the earth's bounty from the solid ground to the floating deck, a ritual of balance and inventory. The cargo was waiting in the warehouse, a vast, dim cathedral of commerce. Here, the goods of the harvest sat in silent rows. The primary export was flour, milled from the wheat fields of the Genesee Valley. It was packed into barrels, hundreds of them, standing shoulder to shoulder like a silent army. These were standard flour barrels, crafted from seasoned oak staves and bound with hoops of dark, rusted iron. Each barrel was identical to the last, a perfect cylinder, waist-high, weighing exactly 196 pounds. The loading began with the rolling of these barrels. A wooden ramp, known as a skid, was laid from the dock to the boat's deck. The dockhands moved with a practiced, lethargic efficiency. A man would tip a barrel onto its rim, feeling the heavy shift of the flour inside. Then he would guide it down the ramp. Rumble, rumble, rumble. The sound was deep and hollow, the wood of the barrel rolling against the wood of the plank. It was a low-frequency vibration that could be felt in the soles of the feet. One by one, the barrels were lowered into the hold. Down in the belly of the boat, men received them. They appended the barrels and slid them into place. Thud, then the next one. Rumble, rumble, thud. They were arranged in tight rows, wood touching wood, leaving no gaps. 10 barrels across, 20 barrels deep. The inventory grew: 50 barrels of fine white flour, 30 kegs of salted pork, heavier and denser, sloshing faintly when moved, 12 hogsheads of molasses, thick and slow-moving, the wood stained dark by the sweet, sticky contents. 20 bushels of dried corn, encased in burlap sacks that scratched against the skin. The sacks were different from the barrels. They did not rumble, they rustled. These were heavy bags of hemp filled with grain, beans, or seed. When a sack was dropped onto the pile, it made a soft, muffled hump sound, exhaling a tiny puff of dust into the air. The dust hung in the shafts of light entering the hatch, a fine mist of organic powder. The sacks were stacked in an interlocking pattern, like bricks one lengthwise to widthwise, creating a stable wall of grain that would not shift during the long journey. On the deck above, the lumber was being loaded. This was the timber of the north, sawn into uniform planks. There were boards of white pine, smelling of sharp resin. There were stacks of ash, pale and heavy. The boards were passed hand to hand, a rhythmic exchange. The sound of lumber stacking was a dry clack-clack-clack as board met board. The tallyman stood by the gangplank, a ledger open in his hands. He was a figure of absolute stillness amidst the slow movement. In his hand was a graphite pencil. With every barrel that rolled past, he made a mark. Scratch, a vertical line. Another barrel. Scratch, another line. After 4 lines, he drew a diagonal slash to mark the 5th. It was a silent count, a mental listing of weight and value. He noted the consignments. Item, red oak staves. Quantity, 1,000. Item, potash. Quantity, 15 casks. Item, wool. Quantity, 6 bales. As the inventory grew, the boat began to change. When the loading started, the deck had been leveled with the dock. Now, with every ton of flour and every stack of pine added, the boat settled deeper into the water. It was a slow, imperceptible sinking. The water crept up the side of the hull, inch by inch, swallowing the draft marks painted on the wood. The boat became heavy, stable, and low. It ceased to bob lightly on the ripples. Instead, it sat firmly in the canal, held in place by the immense gravity of the grain and the wood. The hold was full, the inventory was complete, and the vessel rested heavy and deep, ready for the Towpath. The boat, heavy with its burden of flour and timber, did not move by the power of wind, for the canal was a sheltered ribbon of water where the breeze was often blocked by the trees. Nor did it move by the power of steam or engine. It moved because of a connection to the land, a long hempen umbilical cord that stretched from the bow of the barge to the beaten earth of the bank. Here, on the Towpath, the true engine of the canal was found. The mules, they were not creatures of speed. They were creatures of leverage and patience. Usually, they worked in a pair, hitched in tandem, one behind the other. Let us picture them now. 2 sturdy animals, perhaps named Sal and Bill, standing on the hard-packed dirt. Their coats were coarse and dusty, shaded in varying tones of brown and gray. Their long ears, soft as velvet, swiveled slowly, catching the low drone of the cicadas, but their heads remained lowered, focused on the path ahead. The connection began with the harness. It was a network of thick, dark leather straps, worn smooth by years of friction against hide. The collar, padded with straw and wrapped in canvas, rested heavily around the mule's neck. As the driver gave a low, soft click of his tongue knot, a shout, just a gentle signal, the mules leaned forward. The leather creaked. It was a dry, stretching sound ducriacas, the weight of the boat transferred through the traces. The mules dipped their heads, engaging their powerful shoulders. They did not lunge. They simply walked into the weight. The toll line, which had been dipping into the water, slowly rose, shedding droplets of canal water, until it pulled taut, vibrating slightly in the air. The boat, fighting the inertia of the still water, began to glide. Then the rhythm settled in. This was the heartbeat of the Erie Canal, the sound of hooves on dirt, clop, thud, clop, thud. It was a 4-beat cadence, unchanging and monotonous. The towpath was not paved. It was a trail of clay and soil, beaten down by millions of footsteps until it was as hard as brick in the summer sun. Watch the hooves. The iron shoe lifts, pauses for a fraction of a second in the air, and then descends. It strikes the earth with a dull, flat sound, thud. A small puff of dust rises around the hoof, hanging in the still air for a moment before settling back down. Then the next hoof, thud. There is no variation in the stride. The mules walked at a pace of exactly 4 miles per hour, a speed that felt less like movement and more like the passage of time itself. The driver, often a young boy known as a hoggy, walked beside them, or sometimes behind. He did not need to use a whip. These animals knew their job. They walked in a trance of duty. The path stretched out before them, a straight, flat line bordered by the water on one side and the wildflowers on the other. The only variations in sound were the small, ambient noises of the tack. The brass rings on the harness jingled softly, chink-ching time with the walking. The wooden singletrees bumped against the mule's flanks with a hollow wooden knock. The heavy breathing of the animals provided a steady bass rhythm, a slow exhalation of air through wide nostrils. Occasionally, a mule would twitch its skin to dislodge a fly, or swish its tail in a lazy arc, but their legs never stopped moving. Left, right, left, right. The repetition was absolute. The tow line remained tight, a straight line of tension connecting the living animal to the floating wood. To watch them was to be hypnotized. The landscape slid by at the speed of a walking man. The trees, the fences, the distant barns, they all drifted past in slow motion. The mules did not look at the scenery. They looked only at the ground immediately in front of them, finding the flat spots, avoiding the loose stones, placing one foot after another in an endless, meditative cycle of walking. The sun warmed their backs, the dust coated their legs, and the miles fell away behind them, dissolved by the steady, unrelenting rhythm of the plodding hooves. The rhythm of the mule's hooves ceased, replaced by a drifting silence. The boat, carrying its immense weight of flour and timber, had glided slowly into the narrow embrace of the lock. Here, the open sky was partially blocked by the high walls of gray limestone, cool and damp, rising on either side of the hull. The vessel came to a halt, resting in the center of the chamber, floating on a cushion of water that was about to change. The process of rising was a study in hydrostatics, a slow manipulation of gravity and pressure. It began at the rear of the boat, the lock tender, a figure moving with practiced lethargy. leaned his weight against the long wooden balance beams of the bottom gates. With a low groan of heavy timber, the great doors swung inward. They met in the center of the canal, forming a perfect V-shape, pointing upstream. This was the miter sill, a design borrowed from the genius of Leonardo da Vinci, where the pressure of the water itself forced the gates tighter together, creating a watertight seal. Thump, the gates touched. The lock was now a sealed container, a stone box separating the boat from the lower river. Now the ascent could begin. There were no pumps, no engines, only the simple physics of falling water. The lock tender walked to the front of the chamber, where the upper gates held back the higher water level of the canal ahead. He did not open the gates. That would be impossible against the weight of the water. Instead, he approached the iron mechanisms on the lock walls, the butterfly valves. He placed a heavy iron crank handle onto a square nut protruding from the stone. Clank. He began to turn. Ratchet, click, ratchet, click. The sound was mechanical and slow, echoing off the wet stone walls. Deep underwater, unseen by human eyes, small sluice gates wick slid open. At the bottom of the upper doors, water from the higher level began to rush into the chamber. It did not enter as a wave, but as a swelling, upwelling from the depths. The surface of the water in the lock, previously glass smooth, began to boil gently. Swirls and eddies formed around the hull of the boat. The sound was a soft, continuous rushing, like a heavy rain falling on a lake. She dash, rush, Then the physics of buoyancy took hold. The boat, 100 tons of oak and cargo, began to lift. It was imperceptible at first. You could not feel the motion in your legs. You could only see it by watching the wet, mossy walls of the lock. Focus on a single patch of green moss clinging to the limestone, just at eye level with the deck. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, that patch of moss began to slide downward. The water level was creeping up the stone, inch by inch, taking the boat with it. The water covered a small scratch in the rock, 2 inches. The water swallowed a small fern growing in a crack, 3 inches. The boat drifted slightly to the left, then corrected, buoyed by the rising tide. The air in the lock changed. At the bottom, it had been cool and smelled of wet algae and shadowed stone. As the boat rose, lifting out of the pit, the air became warmer, carrying the scent of the sun-baked fields above. The darkness of the chamber walls gave way to the light. The rushing sound of the water grew quieter as the levels equalized. The turbulence beneath the hull smoothed out. The water inside the lock was now level with the water in the canal ahead. The pressure on the front gates was gone. Equilibrium had been achieved. The violence of gravity had been neutralized by the patience of the stone chamber. Silence returned. The boat sat motionless again, but now it floated 10 feet higher than it had moments ago. The lock tender returned to the balance beams of the upper gates. With the pressure equalized, the heavy doors offered no resistance. He pushed. Creak. The gates swung open, folding into recesses in the stone walls. The path ahead was clear. The water stretched out, a flat, shimmering ribbon at this new, higher elevation. The tow line tightened once more. The boat, having climbed the invisible stair of water, began to drift forward, leaving the stone chamber behind. Ready to continue its slow journey across the spine of the state. The journey began not with a fanfare, but with a disappearance. Albany, the bustling capital where the great Hudson River met the mouth of the canal, was usually a place of brick and noise. But at this hour, in the pre-dawn quiet of a late autumn morning, the city had vanished. The world had been erased by a thick, heavy blanket of river fog. It was a white, opaque stillness that clung to everything. The fog had rolled in from the wide waters of the Hudson during the night, settling into the basin like a physical weight. It was not a drifting mist, but a standing suspension of water and air, so dense that the bow of the boat was barely visible from the stern. The air was cool and wet, tasting faintly of fresh water and damp leaves. It was a world without edges, where the sky and the water merged into a single, seamless canvas of pale gray. On the deck of the packet boat, everything was coated in a fine layer of dew. The wooden railings were slick and cold to the touch. Millions of tiny water droplets clung to the canvas covers of the cargo, glistening like microscopic jewels in the dim, diffuse light. The ropes coiled on the deck were heavy with moisture, darkening from a tan hemp to a deep, wet brown dot. Silence reigned supreme. The fog acted as a great muffler, dampening every sound. The usual clatter of the city, the iron wheels on cobblestones, the shouting of merchants, the ringing of bells was absent. Instead, there were only the intimate, hushed sounds of the immediate vicinity. There was the soft, rhythmic lap-lap-lap of the water against the hull, a gentle, liquid percussion. Occasionally, a timber would creak as the boat shifted lazily in the basin. Somewhere off in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour, but the sound was flat and hollow, stripped of its resonance by the dense air. It sounded miles away, a ghostly note from a world that felt entirely separate from this floating island. Slowly, the process of departure began. It was a movement of shadows. The silhouette of a man appeared on the dock, his form indistinct and gray. He reached for the iron cleat where the boat was moored. There was the soft, wet sound of the heavy rope sliding off the metal. Slither, plop. The line was cast loose. It trailed briefly in the water, creating a silent ripple that vanished instantly into the gray. The boat drifted away from the wooden pilings. There was no sensation of speed, only a feeling of detachment. The dock, the pilings, and the vague shape of the warehouse simply faded away. They did not recede, they dissolved. One moment they were there, dark shapes in the mist, and the next, there was only the white void. As the boat found the center of the channel, the sun began to make its presence known. It was not a distinct orb, nor was it a source of heat. It was merely a shifting of the light. The gray of the fog began to lighten, turning from the color of slate to the color of a pearl. The light was omnipresent, coming from no specific direction, glowing softly from within the vapor itself. The water of the canal was a mirror of this pearlescent sky. It was perfectly flat, a smooth ribbon of mercury stretching out into the unknown. As the boat moved, the bow cut through the water with a sound like tearing silk she dot to the left and right. The banks were invisible. Occasionally, the dark limb of a weeping willow would materialize out of the fog, hanging over the water like a suspended pen stroke, motionless and dripping. Then, as the boat glided past, the tree would be swallowed up again by the white curtain. The mules on the towpath were invisible ghosts, their presence known only by the faint, muffled thud of hooves on the damp earth and the slackening and tightening of the tow line that disappeared into the fog. The boat floated in a capsule of isolation, moving through a cloud that had settled on the earth, drifting silently toward the west in a world where time seemed to have stopped completely, wrapped in the cool, wet embrace of the morning mist. The mist of the morning had long since evaporated, burned away by the ascending sun. But as the boat continued its westward crawl, the light began to change once more. The canal, which had cut through open fields and skirted the edges of towns, now entered the deep, ancient heart of the New York wilderness. Here, the world narrowed. The vast, open sky was replaced by a ceiling of interlocking leaves, and the boat slipped silently into the great green tunnel of the forest. This was not a place of wind or wildness, but a place of profound stillness. The trees grew thick and close to the water's edge, their roots knobby and exposed, drinking from the canal like silent giants. As the boat drifted forward, the sensation was not of moving through the landscape, but of the landscape sliding slowly past the boat. Consider the trees. They were a wall of vertical lines, an endless barcode. There were the sugar maples, their trunks gray and furrowed, their broad, five-pointed leaves forming a dense canopy that filtered the sunlight into dappled pools of gold and emerald. There were the white pines, taller and darker, their needles soft and hushed, standing as ancient sentinels that had watched the valley for centuries. There were the sycamores, with their mottled, peeling bark of white and tan, leaning out over the water as if trying to see their own reflection. And what a reflection it was! The water of the canal, sheltered from the breeze by the dense wall of timber, was absolutely motionless. It was a ribbon of liquid glass, a dark mirror that perfectly duplicated the world above. For hours, the view was a symmetrical masterpiece. For every branch that reached out in the air, a twin branch reached up from the depths. For every green leaf suspended in the humidity of the afternoon, a green leaf loaded in the abyss of the water. The separation between the air and the water seemed to vanish. To look over the side of the barge was to feel a sense of vertigo, a suspension in a sphere of green. The bow of the boat was the only thing that broke the illusion. As it sliced through the water, it created a long V-shaped wake. The ripples rolled out gently, disturbing the reflection of the trees, turning the straight trunks into wavering dancing lines for a moment before the water smoothed itself out again, healing the image as if the boat had never passed. There was no wind here. The air in the forest was heavy, trapped by the density of the foliage. It smelled of rich, decaying leaves, of damp moss, and of the cool, clean scent of deep shade. Not a single leaf moved. The ferns that carpeted the bank's great, feathery fronds of green stood frozen in time. The high branches of the oaks were still against the patches of blue sky. It was a vacuum of motion, a suspended animation, where the only thing moving was the slow, steady drift of the barge. The movement was hypnotic in its repetition. Trunk, water, shadow, light. The visual rhythm was slow and steady. A large oak tree would appear in the distance. Over the course of 5 minutes, it would slowly grow larger. You could see the texture of its bark, the patches of green lichen clinging to its north side. Then, slowly, it would slide alongside the boat, close enough to touch, before drifting behind, receding into the green blur of the past. The forest seemed endless. Mile after mile, the scenery remained a constant variation of the same theme: wood and water. The light grew softer as the afternoon wore on, the shadows of the tree trunks lengthening across the canal, barring the water with stripes of darkness. The boat floated on, a small wooden ship carried along a dark vein in the earth, enveloped completely by the silent, breathing presence of the woods. There was no beginning and no end to the trees, only the continuous, silent drift through the deep, green quiet. The afternoon sun was high and warm, casting a blanket of consistent, golden heat over the valley. The mules plodded on, and the boat drifted. But ahead, the landscape was about to change. The endless corridor of trees and open fields was interrupted by the heavy, gray permanence of engineering. The boat was approaching one of the great stone structures of the waterway, a massive limestone bridge, an aqueduct crossing where the canal was carried or spanned by heavy masonry. As the boat drew closer, the bright sky began to narrow. The structure loomed, a perfect semicircle of darkness cut out of the bright day. It was an arch built for the ages. Blocks of gray stone, stacked with the same slow precision as the locks, but here they formed a ceiling rather than a wall. The transition from the light into the shadow was a physical event. It happened slowly, moving along the length of the boat like a drawing curtain. First, the nose of the mule team passed into the shade, their ears disappearing into the gloom. Then the towline, usually a gleaming stripe of tan hemp in the sun, turned a dull, dark brown as it crossed the threshold of the shadow. Then the shadow reached the boat itself. It moved across the bow, sliding over the wooden deck, swallowing the crates and barrels in a wave of sudden coolness. The air temperature dropped instantly. It was a sharp, refreshing chill, distinct from the humid warmth of the open water. It felt as if the boat were entering a cellar or a cave, a place where the air had been trapped and cooled by the damp stone for decades. As the center of the barge drifted beneath the great stone arch, the world became dim. The sunlight could not reach here. The water, stripped of its sparkling reflection of the sky, turned a deep, inky black. It looked thicker, heavier, swirling quietly against the foundation of the bridge. The sound changed, too. In the open air, the sounds of the canal, the splash of water, the creak of wood, the breathing of the mules, dissipated into the wide fields. But here, under the vault of the aqueduct, the sounds were trapped. They bounced off the curved stone ceiling and returned to the boat, magnified and resonant. The lap, lap, lap of the wake against the canal walls became a hollow, rhythmic clomp clomp. The breathing of the mules ahead echoed back as a low, ghostly snort. Even the silence seemed louder here, a heavy, pressurized quiet that filled the space between the water and the stone arch dot above. The underside of the bridge was a landscape of its own. As the boat glided slowly beneath it, one could look up and see the weeping masonry. The limestone blocks were stained with the slow passage of moisture. Mineral deposits, white and chalky, had formed slow-moving streaks down the curve of the arch. Patches of dark green moss clung to the mortar, thriving in the eternal twilight of the underpass. Occasionally, a single drop of cold water would fall from the zenith of the arch, plip-landing on the deck or in the dark water, a tiny metronome counting the seconds of the crossing. The passage was brief in distance, but felt long in time. The boat was suspended in this cool, gray tunnel, cut off from the warmth of the sun and the view of the trees. It was a moment of containment, a brief pause in the visual overload of the journey. Then, just as gradually as it had begun, the exit approached. The jagged line of the shadow moved toward the stern. The bow of the boat poked out into the brilliance of the afternoon. The colors returned: the blue of the water, the green of the grass, the brown of the path. The warmth hit the deck again, chasing away the chill of the stone. The echo faded, replaced once more by the soft, open whisper of the wind in the reeds. The bridge, with its heavy shadow and cool air, was left behind, a silent monument standing watch over the water, holding its pocket of darkness as the boat drifted on into the light. The sun had climbed the ladder of the sky and now sat at its absolute zenith. It was high noon over the Mohawk Valley, and the world seemed to pause under the weight of the light. The shadows, which had stretched long and cool in the morning, had now retracted, hiding beneath the trees and under the eaves of the barge. There was nowhere to hide from the warmth. It was a full, heavy heat, the kind that presses down on the eyelids and slows the blood. With the heat came the sound. It rose from the trees lining the canal banks, from the hidden groves of oak and maple that stood motionless in the dead air. It was the song of the cicadas. It was not a melody, but a vibration, a sonic texture that filled every cubic inch of the atmosphere. Z-UU-Z-UU-Z-UU. It was a dry, rasping drone, an electric static generated by thousands of unseen wings. The sound began as a low hum, barely audible, then swelled in volume, rising in a slow, rhythmic crescendo that peaked in a shrill, metallic buzz before fading back down into the background hum. It was the sound of heat itself made audible. It was a monotonous, unending loop, a wall of noise that became so constant it eventually ceased to be a sound and became a feeling, a tingling pressure in the ears. The air was still. The flags on the stern of the boat hung limp and lifeless against the pole. The surface of the canal was flat and oily, reflecting the glare of the sun with a blinding intensity. Heat waves, or shimmer, rose from the beaten dirt of the towpath, distorting the air so that the distant trees looked like a watercolor painting left out in the rain on the boat. The activity of the morning had dissolved into a collective stupor. The energy required to move, to speak, or even to think was simply too great. The crew had surrendered to the drowsiness of the hour. The steersman stood at the tiller, but his posture was one of deep relaxation. He leaned heavily against the smooth wooden arm of the rudder, letting his weight do the work of keeping the boat straight. His hat was pulled low over his eyes, shading his face from the glare. His breathing was slow and deep. Every few minutes, his chin would dip toward his chest, a momentary surrender to sleep, before he would catch himself, blink slowly, and gaze back out at the endless, straight line of the water. On the deck, a deckhand lay sprawled across a pile of grain sacks. He had found a small patch of shade cast by the cabin. His arm was thrown over his eyes. He did not move. He was not asleep, but he was drifting in that twilight state between waking and dreaming, floating on the slow current of the afternoon. Even the mules seemed to be moving through molasses. Their heads hung lower than before. The rhythmic clop-clop of their hooves had slowed down, the tempo dragging. They walked with their eyes half closed, guided not by sight, but by the familiar, dusty feel of the path under their feet. The driver, the young Hoggy, walked behind them, dragging his boots in the dirt. He did not whistle. He did not shout. He simply placed one foot in front of the other, hypnotized by the swaying tails of the animals and the relentless drone of the insects. Buzz. Zzz, 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 zzz. The sound of the cicadas filled the silence completely. It washed over the boat, a wave of white noise that scrubbed away all other thoughts. There was no past, no future, only this hot, buzzing present. The heat baked the wood of the deck, releasing the scent of warm pine and tar, which mingled with the dry, dusty smell of the path. The boat drifted on, a speck in the vast, vibrating landscape. The world was suspended in amber, trapped in the slow, thick heat of the midday sun. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to happen. There was only the heat, the slow drift of the water, and the endless, hypnotic song of the cicadas singing the world to sleep. As the afternoon stretched on, lengthening the shadows and softening the light, the attention of the traveler drifted from the horizon to the immediate world of the canal bank. At the speed of a trotting horse, the landscape is a blur of motion, but at the speed of a towed barge steady, unhurried for miles per hour, the world does not blur. Instead, it unspools like a long, continuous ribbon of tapestry. Every stem, every leaf, and every petal is visible, offering a study in slow botany to eyes weary from the glare of the sun. The bank was a chaotic, lush garden planted by the wind and the birds. It was a riot of texture and green, but if one looked closely, there was a distinct order to the chaos, a layering of life that moved past the boat in a hypnotic parade. Closest to the water, where the soil was perpetually dark and damp, stood the sentinels of the wetlands, the broadleaf cattails. They grew in dense vertical clusters, their long, sword-like leaves twisting slightly as they reached for the sky. They were a deep, rich green, standing tall and rigid. At the top of the stiff stalks sat the brown, velvety cylinders of the flower spikes. To the eye, they looked like soft, felt, dense, and perfectly cylindrical, swaying imperceptibly in the wake of the passing boat. They passed by, one after another, stalk leaf, brown velveta, repetitive fence of nature, separating the water from the land, just behind them. Where the ground rose slightly toward the towpath, the wildflowers took hold. The most abundant was the Queen Anne's lace. It was a plant of intricate geometry. From the boat, you could see the flat-topped clusters of tiny white flowers hovering over the grass like suspended doilies. Each flower head was a universe unto itself, made up of dozens of smaller stems, radiating from a center point, blooming into a lace-like canopy. If you looked with heavy, relaxed eyes, you might spot the single, tiny purple floret that often sat in the very center of the white expanse, a solitary dark dot in a sea of pale cream. Intermingled with the white lace was the dusty yellow of the goldenrod. These plants were heavier, their plumes of tiny yellow flowers arching downward under their own weight. They looked soft and powdery, as if a gentle shake would release a cloud of gold dust. They nodded slowly as the boat passed, bowing to the water. Rising above the lower grasses was the jopai weed, standing tall with its whorled leaves and large, fuzzy clusters of mauve-pink flowers. The color was soft, a muted purple that blended gently with the green shadows of the bank. It smelled faintly of vanilla when crushed, though here, from the deck, it was just a visual texture, a soft, rounded shape against the sharp lines of the grass. Tangled among these stems were the vines. The riverbank grape was an opportunist, sending its woody brown tendrils curling round the fence posts and the trunks of willow saplings. The leaves were broad and heart-shaped, casting small umbrellas of shade. The tendrils were like coiled springs, tight and green, gripping the world with a silent strength. They seemed to freeze in mid-climb, caught in a suspended animation as the barge glided by. Occasionally, the uniform green was broken by the bright crimson of the staghorn sumac. These shrubs grew in colonies, their branches covered in a fine velvet fuzz that resembled the antlers of a deer. At the tips of the branches sat the conical clusters of red berries, upright and fuzzy, burning slowly with color against the backdrop of the forest edge. There was a rhythm to the plants. A patch of white clover would slide by, a low carpet of green and white, then a thicket of ferns, their fronds uncurled and delicate, looking like green lace cut from paper. Then the tall, sturdy stalks of the common milkweed, with their thick, oval leaves, and the heavy, teardrop-shaped pods. The pods were rough and bumpy, filled with the promise of silk that would not be released until the autumn winds arrived. The barge moved on, and the flowers scrolled past like a painting that never ended. There was no wind to rustle them, no animals to disturb them. They simply stood there, rooted in the earth, offering their complex shapes and quiet colors to the silence of the afternoon, a green and blooming lullaby for the eyes. The sun, which had been the undisputed ruler of the sky for so many hours, finally began its retreat. It slipped below the western horizon, not with a sudden drop, but with a slow, graceful fading. The fierce white light of noon softened into a bruise of purple and indigo, spreading across the vast canopy of the heavens. The sharp edges of the world began to blur. The distinct lines of the trees, the fence posts, and the distant barns lost their definition, melting into soft, gray silhouettes against the deepening blue of the twilight. This was the blue hour, a quiet interlude between the day and the night. The colors of the canal bank, the red of the sumac drained away, replaced by a uniform, monochromatic, cool tone. The water of the canal ceased to be a mirror of the sky and became a dark, mysterious pool, absorbing the coming night. On the deck of the packet boat, the change was felt in the air before it was seen. The heat of the day lifted, replaced by a fresh, crisp coolness that rose from the water. It was time for the ritual of the evening. It was time to push back the encroaching dark with a small, contained fire. The boat captain moved to the bow. His movements were not hurried. They were part of a routine performed thousands of times, a muscle memory of the evening. Mounted on the front of the cabin was the great bow lamp, a heavy fixture of brass and glass designed to cast a beam down the center of the waterway. He unlatched the glass door of the lantern housing. Click. The sound was sharp in the quiet air. He swung the little door open. Inside, the brass font held the oil, perhaps whale oil, or the newer kerosene waiting to be transformed into light. The smell was distinct, a faint, acrid scent of fuel that mingled with the damp smell of the evening mist. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. He took out a single match, its head coated in sulfur. He found a rough patch on the railing and struck it. SK rich dash fizz dot. A sudden flare of orange light erupted, blindingly bright in the dimness. He cupped his hands around the flame to protect it from the gentle draft of the boat's movement. He guided the match to the wick inside the lantern. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the black, carbon-crusted wick caught the flame. A small, blue-bottomed tongue of yellow fire sprang to life. He watched it for a moment, ensuring it would hold. He adjusted a small brass knob on the side of the burner, turning it slowly. Twist, twist. The wick rose, millimeter by millimeter. The flame grew, widening and brightening, turning from a weak flicker into a steady, glowing almond of light. He closed the glass door. Clicked at the transformation was instant. The light was captured by the curved reflector behind the flame and thrown forward. A cone of warm, amber light cut through the blue darkness. It illuminated the water ahead, turning the dark surface into a path of gold. It caught the wooden tow line, making it glow like a golden thread stretching out into the night. It reached the mules on the towpath, casting long, dancing shadows of their legs against the trees. Then he moved to the stern. There were smaller lanterns here, hanging from hooks near the tiller. He repeated the ritual. Open, strike. Light, adjust, close. One by one, the pools of light appeared. The boat was no longer just a shape in the dark. It was a warm, floating island of illumination. The light did not reach farge enough to see the deck. The hands of the steersman and the immediate water butt, it was enough. It created a sense of profound enclosure. The rest of the world, the forests, the hills, the distant towns had vanished into the void of the night. All that existed was this wooden vessel, the rhythmic sound of the water, and the soft, comforting hiss of the oil lamps burning steadily. The smoke from the lanterns drifted up, invisible in the dark, carrying the scent of the burning oil away in the wake. The darkness settled completely now, wrapping around the boat like a heavy velvet blanket. The lantern light was a promise of safety, a steady, unwavering beacon guiding the way through the sleeping valley. Mile after quiet mile, the lanterns have flickered out. The season of movement has drawn to its inevitable close. As the calendar turned the pages from November into the depths of December, the air over the Mohawk Valley underwent a fundamental change. It ceased to be merely cool. It became brittle, sharp, and crystalline. The moisture that had hung in the air as mist now fell to the earth as frost, coating the railings of the barge in a delicate white lace that sparkled in the pale morning light. The water, the lifeblood of the canal, began to slow down. It was not a slowing of the current, but a thickening of the element itself. The temperature dropped day by day, degree by degree, until the water lost its fluidity. The freeze began at the edges, along the banks, where the water was shallow and still among the reeds. Thin sheets of ice began to form. They were transparent, at first like panes of glass, extending fragile fingers toward the center of the channel. These were the needles of crystallization, weaving together a blanket oscillate matter over the liquid depth. Then came the heavy cold of the midwinter nights. Under the light of a distant frozen moon, the canal surrendered its motion entirely. The separate sheets of ice met in the middle. They locked together. The surface, once rippled by the wind and the wake of boats, was now smooth, hard, and silent. The canal was no longer a river. It was a road of gray ice, stretching hundreds of miles from Albany to Buffalo, a frozen ribbon binding the state together in stillness. The boats were docked. The great wooden barges, which had spent the summer drifting through the forests and fields, were now tied securely to the wharves in winter basins. They sat low in the ice. The water had frozen around their hulls, gripping the wood in a tight, unyielding embrace. The boats would not move again for months. They were sleeping giants, their decks cleared of cargo, their cabins empty, their rudders locked in place by the freeze. The mules were gone, led away to warm, straw-filled barns where they would rest and eat through the long winter. The towpath, beaten hard by their hooves over the summer, was empty. The rhythmic CLOP that had defined the days was replaced by a profound absence of sound. Then the snow began to fall. It started as a few stray flakes drifting down lazily from a leaden sky. They were large, soft flakes descending in slow motion. There was no wind to drive them, only gravity pulling them gently to the earth. Soft, silent, white, they landed on the frozen surface of the canal. They landed on the wooden decks of the sleeping boats. They landed on the slate roofs of the lock tender's house. Slowly, the world began to lose its color. The gray of the ice, the brown of the path, the black of the tree trunk saw of it, was softened and buried under a layer of pristine white. The snow accumulated, inch by inch. It filled the hollows of the empty locks, turning the stone chambers into deep wells of snow. It capped the fence posts with rounded white hats. It erased the line between the canal and the land. Now, looking out over the valley, there was no water, no path, no edge. There was only a sweeping, undulating expanse of white, unbroken, and pure. The silence was absolute. Snow is a great insulator. It absorbs sound, swallowing the noise of the world. There were no birds singing in the bare branches. There was no splash of water. There was no creak of rope. There was only the muffled quiet of a world wrapped in cotton. The canal slept. It was a deep hibernation sleep. Under the ice and the snow, the water waited in darkness, still and heavy. The energy of the summer, the commerce, the travel-lit, was all a distant memory. Now there was only the cold, the dark, and the peace of the pause. The entire valley lay suspended in this frozen moment. The snowflakes continued to fall, adding layer upon layer to the blanket, tucking the earth in for the long night. Everything had stopped. Everything was still. And in this great white silence, the story of the canal drifts away, leaving only the quiet, the dark, and the deep, restful sleep of winter.